Ever wonder what makes the greats great? What makes the successful successful? What makes the brilliant brilliant? Our Tuesday meetups with the celebrities of pharma industry and science are your one-stop shop to all these answers and more. Join us for Pies of Life, an initiative of the Biopatrika Industry Mentorship Program, where we bring your dream mentors to you.
Welcome everyone to our Pies of Life, a mentorship session by Biopatrika. Before starting, I would like to go over some housekeeping rules. Please keep your mics on mute. Do not record any part of this session. And for asking questions, please raise your hand and I will call your name. Then you can briefly introduce yourself and ask questions, or you can also post your questions in the chat box. As this is an interactive session, so please don't hesitate to ask questions. This Tuesday, we have with us a dynamic personality and an amazing author, Ashok Krish. Ashok is the head of the digital workplace unit at Tata Consultancy Services. He is also the head of the social media and workplace reimagination practice at TCS Digital Enterprise. Other than his work, he is an author. He loves cooking. He is a columnist. He also plays violin, guitar, and cello. To quote Peter Bram, the kitchen itself is a laboratory and cooking is an experimental science. Our speaker for the day, Ashok, is an exemplar of this quote. He is the author of the book, The Masala Lab, which takes a scientific interpretation of the millennium old Indian cooking styles. His journey into the world of cooking has demystified the science behind cooking and has motivated a lot of curious cooks into designing their own culinary experiments. So please welcome a multi-talented personality, Ashok Krish. So Ashok, we would like to hear your journey in your words.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for the honor. And I think it's quite interesting. So the book itself was something that I didn't imagine that I would write a book about food science. And yet, quite interestingly, it was the only book that I could have written in 6 weeks, which I did. Because I had sort of noted down observations of what I had done in terms of how much water did I use and what worked and what did not work over the last 10 or 15 years. And that way the book was more an exercise in leaving things out rather than cramming everything in. Otherwise, I had about 500 pages worth of stuff that I could have written. But what I want to do is kind of really try and use my 10 minutes to answer a deeper question about why science in cooking. Okay. And hopefully by the end, I think the answer should be why not. Actually, you should have a good reason for why you should not look at cooking through the lens of science. And I want to do that by quickly telling you a very short story of something as I was kind of thinking about cooking itself. I'm just quickly going to share my screen. Just let me know once you're seeing my screen. One of the things that obviously in the last 2 or 3 years is that I kind of realized that when somebody tells you, tell me something about a chicken curry. Okay. If you're vegetarian, please assume paneer curry or dal or something. But I'm going to go with what is perhaps the single most widely eaten side dish in India, okay, which is chicken curry. Right? About 70 to 80% of the Indian population is meat eating, more than 90% in the south, a little less so in the north. Right? So if you ask people, what is chicken curry? People might tell you either a recipe. Let's say, oh, it is you marinate the chicken, you take all of these spices, and then you let the chicken cook at a low temperature so that it doesn't overcook. You add some kind of gravy, and if you cook it with the bones, it'll naturally thicken, and so on. And an experienced chef or a cook will tell you exactly how to make a chicken curry. Then say maybe add garam masala at the end and so on. Right? Then you'd have maybe someone else might say, oh, my grandmother who came from during partition from what is today Pakistan, she had a fantastic recipe from Lahore, and it's a recipe that has been passed down over years, and they used to have chickens running around their house. And so there's a certain sort of social, political, historical angle to food. And yet what is fascinating is that somehow we seem to miss the science story, right? And my view is that, look, I think you can tell absolutely fantastic scientific scientific history of the chicken curry, right? And I'm going to try and do that. This is actually sort of like I originally did this as a TEDx talk, so it's sort of more 18 minutes, but I'm going to try and do this within 8 or 9 minutes or so. Okay. So the tale of the chicken curry as seen through the lens of Siam. 2.7 billion years ago, we know that the earliest forms of life were essentially single-celled organisms called prokaryotes, right? Essentially, very simply, life as we see it, and I think this is a very, very arbitrary distinction, is that once you have kind of a cell wall or some kind of a membrane that holds together different things inside and creates, in some sense, lower entropy than the outside, right? That's about the and very approximate sense of what's the boundary between life and non-life, right? Chemicals are just life, right? So prokaryotes were the first. For most of our living history, these were essentially the most dominant forms of life. At some point of time, one of these prokaryotes essentially ate another one. Okay. Normally, it would just disassemble it, use digestive enzymes, break it down into components, amino acids, and use it to feed itself. But in this particular case, and again, because this happened trillions and trillions of times, one particular case, it did not quite eat it, but ended up forming what's called an endosymbiotic relationship with that, right? But it just so turns out one of these situations, it turned out to be a fantastic example of this, because the bacterium or the single cell prokaryote that was eaten ended up becoming an organ that we now know as the mitochondria, right? And then that essentially gave this particular cell fantastic properties. For starters, this other cell inside it could simply focus on energy production and not worry about defense or anything else, right? So it's purely being able to churn out energy, and so it is much more efficient and therefore had much more capabilities than the previous generation, right? And then fast forward to about 450 billion to 2 billion years ago, this happened again. One of these eukaryotic cells ate up another cell, this time a single-celled organism that was able to tap energy from sunlight and turn it into glucose, right? And this then became the first plant cell as we know it. And this was the start of what you call the photosynthetic revolution. Again, what we think is trees and plants are very, very recent. For most of Earth's history, we largely had single-celled plants, and even today, the large bulk of the world's oxygen is produced by a single-celled algae, plankton, on the surface of the ocean. So, long story short, photosynthesis essentially gave us a class of living things that was able to turn the energy of the sun and use a very laborious process, if you will. And the reason it's laborious is, again, a fascinating story, right? This process was very inefficient when the Earth's oxygen levels were very low. As soon as and this was so successful so quickly that the Earth's oxygen levels went up, and all of the rest of our life became possible because these single cell algae produced so much oxygen in such a short time, but they also ended up shooting themselves in the foot. So photosynthesis became slow and inefficient, okay, as a result of high concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere, which anyway the plants produce. So long story short, the reason why plants don't move around and eat other things is because photosynthesis is exceedingly slow. On the other hand, animals can simply eat plants. And so their metabolic rate, if you will, is much higher, right? So that's why animals are animals and plants are plants, right? And plants is essentially the source of all of the carbohydrates that we today eat in our diet. Obviously, I'm fast forwarding to the discovery of agriculture and the taming of specific grasses and grains and others that allowed us to essentially, and pulses and so on, that allowed us to get both plant carbohydrates and some amount of protein, if you will, from plants, right? And then let's also understand that plants, since they cannot move, need to defend themselves. And when they need to defend themselves, since they cannot move, they don't have tentacles, they can't fight you, they can't bite you, they use chemical warfare. So plants are fantastic at chemistry. So they produce a range of toxins and pesticides and natural ways of defending against fungi and microbes and insects and everything else that wants to eat them, right? So every family of plant has a different defense. Some use physical defenses, like a coconut is really, really hard and it's hard to get into, although the rhinoceros beetle ultimately will. On the other hand, garlic uses ethyl mercaptan. Onion uses essentially a particular chemical that is produced by an enzymatic reaction when you cut open a cell that ultimately creates a volatile gas that, when it reaches your eyes, breaks down into dilute sulfuric acid. So an onion's way of defending itself is to do a mild acid attack on your eyes. For us, it's fine, but for a small insect, lethal, right? So that's the entire sort of, every spice that we know is a defense mechanism, right? Every one of these spice flavors is a defense mechanism. So the interesting insight is that the more a plant is likely to be attacked by a pest, the more flavor it will produce in what we eat, right? So that's in a sense that. So therefore, when you really think about in the chicken curry, the ingredients that we all eat, all the way from the onion to garlic to ginger to chilies, which uses a molecule called capsaicin, in order to trick our nervous system into thinking that our mouth is on fire. So it's quite amazing, the range of chemical defenses, all of which are ultimately flavor, right? Tomatoes and so on. And the funny thing is chilies and tomatoes are not even Indian in origin. They come from Mexico. They reached India only in the 16th or 17th century, right? Cumin, curry leaves and so on, coriander, every one of these ingredients essentially has a 3 billion story of from photosynthesis to the production of carbohydrates to the synthesis of essentially flavor molecules that are essentially chemical weapons, if you will, which obviously we are able to tame with cooking, right? So eugenol in clove is toxic, but in the amounts that it is present inside a clove, it's quite okay, right? Actual clove essential oil, eugenol, is exceedingly toxic, right? And so on. So again, now let's go to the animal side, right? 65 billion years ago, the world was dominated by dinosaurs for almost 300 billion years. And then all of a sudden you had a meteor, you had an asteroid that created one of the largest cataclysmic events in the history of the planet, right? It wiped out 80% of all life on Earth, particularly all forms of large life, including plants as well as animals. Interestingly, the animals that survived are the smaller mammals that were more rat-like and were burrowing underground, and a few burrowing reptiles, smaller sized reptiles, which ultimately later we now see as the crocodiles and the lizards and so on, and turtles and so on. More importantly, also the flying reptiles that were able to sort of escape from the cataclysm with the smaller sized flying reptiles, right? Now, the interesting thing is that given that this entire cataclysm happened in what is today Mexico, we kind of assume that dinosaurs look like this, but now science tells us that dinosaurs probably had feathers. Okay, this is probably what they look like. So I'm here to tell you that one of those surviving flying tiny dinosaurs went on to evolve into what is today the jungle fowl, which was domesticated in India 9,000 years ago and turned into what we eat today as chicken, right? So when you eat a chicken, you're literally eating a descendant of the dinosaurs. Okay, so now you can sort of see the resemblance, right? So again, animal tissue, right? Muscle tissue is designed for movement, right? So that's why muscle tissue and meat has the texture. It is flexible, right? Because muscles have to move. Plants are rigid. That's why vegetable taste crisp and crunchy, because plants need stability. Muscle tissue has the texture because the animals have to move, right? In fact, you can see an animal that moves a lot more has chewier meat than an animal that barely moves. In fact, caged birds, taste different than freely roaming birds, just as an example, right? And so you have your ingredients, you have the chicken, you have butter, which obviously comes from mammals and milk. And from there, you get your ingredients and the story of those ingredients. From there, it is a case of what material science, the conduction versus convection in your kitchen, flavor absorption, breaking large molecules into small, browning, which is one of the most important chemical reactions in the kitchen. Why do vegetables need to be cooked separately and in a different way from meat because of the way the cellular structure is, and how you can use other forms of heat, like microwave and so on. And the flavor biochemistry about how we experience it once you actually eat it. Taste, aroma, mouthfeel, all of it resulting in flavor memories. And the minimal role that our tongue actually plays, although we kind of think, all taste happens on the tongue. And what happens during digestion, right? Cooking is the outsourcing of digestion. We're partially breaking down stuff. So we have to do less work while we digest. Whereas a cow has to spend 60 or 70% of its energy digesting the food that it does. And all that extra energy we have goes into the giant brain that we have. And one of the reasons we are human is because we cook. And so in that sense, I think it's a fascinating story. And the ability of humans to enroll microbes to specifically do some work for us, friendly microbes, right? See, the difference between rotting and fermentation is rotting by friendly microbes. Rotting is fermentation by bad microbes because they generate poisons that will then hurt you, right? Because they don't want you to eat. But lactobacteria and yeast, well, one produces lactic acid, which tastes pleasantly sour. The other one produces alcohol, which of course everyone loves, right? And so therefore, beyond that, there is now the emerging science of how our brain itself is wired very, very weirdly in terms of how we experience flavor. How the color of food impacts how we experience it. Why should a chicken curry be red? If a chicken curry was green, you would not find it as appetizing, right? You would actually, we associate the color green with bitter. We associate the color red with sweet tastes, and so on. So these are, so which is why even if you take a synthetic sort of candy and have it in the flavor of strawberry, if it's yellow in color, people often have trouble recognizing it as strawberry, because you see a yellow candy, it has to be lemon flavored. It cannot be strawberry flavored, right? Shape, rounder shapes taste sweeter. Funny story, Cadbury's dairy milk used to be square shaped. And at one point of time, they changed it to round shaped. They actually changed it for pure physics reasons, because rounder shape, less volume. So since price had gone up, they didn't want to increase the price. They just reduced the amount of chocolate, but they didn't want to reduce the dimensions visibly. So they just made it rounder. So it's actually less volume. The interesting thing is that people started complaining that your chocolate has become sweeter. And Cadbury CEO had to say, no, actually, we've not changed the recipe. All we did is change the shape. Well, the gastrophysics now says that shapes actually impact how we perceive taste as well. So many other things that how you can prime people into experiencing certain things. If you don't tell someone it's an expensive wine, they will rate it badly. But the moment you tell someone it's an expensive wine, they will rate it well, right? And how your emotional state, if your favorite cricket team or a football team wins a match, food is likely to taste sweeter than if your teabag actually lost a match, and so on. So what essentially it all means is that there is such a fantastic part of the story of food that we're not telling our kids, right? And so one of the things that I do is to teach kids high school science and high school biology, which anyway, and physics and chemistry, which is generally taught using terrible examples, through the lens of food, right? The kitchen is something that you see every day in your house, right? Why can't you treat that as a laboratory? Not necessarily for culinary experimentation, but simply for science education as well, right? So in a sense, I think me writing Masala Lab was from that sort of sense of wonder that there is just so much that goes into making our food. And we've lost that relationship with that, right? So we don't till the land anymore. We don't grow our own food. And again, we live in societies where the people growing our food are very, very far away from you in every sense of the word. And so that, in a sense, understanding sustainability, understanding, what is organic, what is non-organic, why is it tastier, and so on. Why is, for instance, frozen food actually fresher than fresh food in many situations, and how judging food is actually a very subjective experience, right? We all experience flavors through the lens of our own nostalgia, because it's that part of the brain that deals with remembering flavor memories. So everyone's food opinions are completely bogus. If somebody says this is a great restaurant, they're not saying anything except the fact that the taste of the food in that restaurant triggered my nostalgia based on how I'm used to it. That's all it is saying. There is no objective way to rate food beyond the basic things of salt levels and texture and things like that, right? So that essentially is my journey of how I came to write Masala Lab. And I think I just wanted to give a very quick sort of introduction and maybe spend more time interacting with you guys rather than it be a one-way thing.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ashok. That was really interesting. Now, I would like to ask our audience to just raise your hands, or if you would like to ask questions, you can also post it in the chat box. I can see Santoshi has a question. Santoshi, please go ahead.
Hi, Ashok. Big fan of your book. It was my brother who recommended it, and mostly like me and my brother are not so compatible with each other. So I was like, okay, I'll just give it a chance. The wittiness that goes along with the book is so amazing. I mean, it's not just, dry physics, chemistry, biology, everything in there. So great job on that. Now I have the Kindle version. I will soon buy a hard copy and probably get a signed version from you. Hoping to get that. My question was also when I was reading the book about capsaicin. Sorry.
Capsaicin, yes.
Yeah, and you say that the receptors, it's kind of a way of fooling us to think that, our mouth is on fire, but it's not just with the mouth, right? So it's also in our gluteus maximus, also commonly called
everywhere
as ass or butt.
Yes.
So do you also think that the receptors are also there?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Actually, incidentally, these receptors, the trigeminal nervous system is everywhere. So obviously there's a great density of those receptors in your mouth, but they're everywhere, right? And as most women will know, the pepper spray is also just capsaicin. Okay. And again, it's a perfect thing because you want to disable the person without causing any long-term damage. And again, because it's a phantom pain than actual damage, right? So the eye just shuts down, saying that, okay, the eye's on fire, I'm going to shut down. And then it takes a while for the brain to figure out that, okay, actually nothing's wrong. So it's a false alarm, right? And so that's, any other sort of chemical would likely have caused long-term damage. And I think for a basic self-defense mechanism that could very well be used accidentally. I think it's quite fascinating. And it's quite interesting. We use it in paint sprays. All your Iodex and Tiger Balm and all the family, all of them use capsaicin, right? And interesting. So it's funny how brands will often say, the ones that say all natural, right? So no chemicals, all natural and so on. They will not use the word capsaicin because it sounds like a chemical. You watch those, they'll say capsicum extract, okay. which is really funny. Of all the fruits in that family, it's the capsicum or the bell pepper that has no capsaicin, okay, because it doesn't have any heat, right? But anyway, it's funny. So yes. So it will. That's why chilies burn your hand, they burn your skin, and they continue to burn as you eat and digest your food till the next day, as you rightly said. Yes.
Yeah. And I just wanted to also highlight the point of the MSG, what you wrote in the book. Really impressive because, the bad name that MSG has, and what people also forget that tomato is the biggest source of MSG. I'm trying to convince my in-laws that MSG is not good. I mean, anything in huge quantity is not good, but yeah, I think MSG
obviously
has
that's true of everything, right? The best trick is to essentially say, bake tomato salad, right? You slice tomatoes, okay? Then you sprinkle salt on it, and then give it to people and say, hey, doesn't salted tomato taste so delicious, so much more delicious than plain tomato? Because it does. And it's not just the salt creating the magic, because it's just that, well, effectively, when you add sodium chloride to glutamic acid, you're producing monosodium glutamate effectively, okay? At least in solution form. So that's the thing. I think, it's sometimes it's hard to explain to people that, look, you have roughly 2 kgs of glutamic acid in your body, okay? Because in all the muscles and all the proteins that make up your body, there's a lot of glutamic acid, okay? And so clearly 1/4 teaspoon in your chow mein is not going to harm you. Quite likely. It's possible some people are allergic. That's true of everything, but there are far more people allergic to wheat or gluten or anything else, or peanuts, far more lethal than people who are allergic to MSG itself. And you're going to eat it in so many shapes and forms. Parmesan cheese, right? Every time you eat seafood, particularly seaweed or any kind of Japanese food, they're just all rich sources. In fact, MSG was first isolated in seaweed, dried seaweed, that is used to make Japanese stocks when they make these ramen broths and so on. It's all heavily MSG based. Yes.
So Ashok, that was, I'll say, like wonderful presentation and something like we wanted to hear. So as you mentioned, like you were taking notes for almost 15 years, that led to the book Masala Lab. So, but what was the inspiration for taking notes? So normally I think this is something we miss even when we are in like school or college, that we don't take notes and we just forgot about things. So what was it like which motivated you?
I think, see, I grew up being sort of someone who very quickly kind of got into the sort of engineering way of thinking about things, right? So break things down into smaller pieces and then, figure out that each piece. And I did that for how I learned my music, and again, it also, I guess it came from the fact that I did not like memorizing things very early in life. Okay? So, and so for me, the way to sort of be decent academically, et cetera, because the Indian system is brutal if you don't memorize, right? And so essentially I had to find sort of first principles way of deriving everything rather than remembering large amounts of stuff, which, I mean, I used to hate history and other things because it was genuinely, you just had to memorize. But even then I felt that if history was remembered more as a story rather than as a dry set of facts, you're far more likely to remember, right? So, my grandmother used to tell us, stories from mythology and all that. I remember every one of those things, every bit of that detail now, despite, being 40, hearing them 40 years ago. I don't remember the history that I was taught in high school, right? And the reason for that is that I think it's also the storytelling is a very crucial part of this entire thing, right? And that's true of all these. So taking notes for me was essentially my software engineering hat way of essentially trying to look at a problem and break it down into smaller pieces, and then do A/B testing of multiple things and see which one works and so on. That's just plain software engineering that again comes from my my career as well. So it was when I first started trying to take cooking seriously is when I traveled abroad in my early 20s. And I obviously visited every old person in the family to get their recipes and so on. And I had trouble. They had trouble telling me recipes. So they said, you take me to the kitchen, I'll make it for you. But I have trouble remembering every little bit of detail. And don't ask me whether it's half teaspoon, quarter teaspoon, and things like that. So very early, I kind of came to the realization that good cooks don't seem to think in terms of recipes. They seem to think in terms of meta models, right? Then again, the software idea that it's about different modular bits and different heuristics. And these heuristics, I knew that these were all scientifically valid heuristics because they had been observed and tested over hundreds, if not thousands of years, right? So the amount of rice, the amount of water you add to rice, our grandmothers knew it intuitively, right? And they know it intuitively because they've been taught that, and it's through observation in some sense, right? It's oral history. The fact that they didn't take down notes again is a function of the fact that women did not get access to literacy till very recently. So it's again orally transmitted tacit knowledge, but observational science nonetheless, right? And often that's why I find that your grandmother has a far more greater degree of chance of being scientifically accurate than half the people you read on the internet. They're the ones making up stuff, right? With completely untested, unverified stuff and so on, right? So in that sense, I think the entire idea of taking down notes was for me a way of using software engineering to break things down into smaller pieces, be able to test, see which one works, which one doesn't work. And so that's essentially how it came about.
Oh, that's nice. And I think I'll add to this one more question. So as you mentioned, we have so much misinformation on YouTube about food particularly. We have so many channels and everyone is a chef or cook nowadays. So how to get actual or accurate information? Do you have some reference books which we can maybe reference?
It's really hard. To be honest, I think nothing to be honest actually beats trying things yourself. So my approach, for example, I think everyone has a different approach. My approach of trying to research a dish that I want to bake, right, is to often watch multiple YouTube videos, right? And the first thing that I'm, again, typical software engineering mindset, I'm looking at multiple videos and then mentally dismissing any particular step or this thing that only one or two videos saying, oh, this is absolutely crucial and you have to do this. Because if somebody else is able to make this without that step, chances are it's probably not an ultra critical step and so on. So again, a way of really getting it down to the absolute bare minimalist representation of that, right? Always be suspicious of recipes that have 200,000 ingredients and 50 steps. Okay? In a sense, at least you need to know how to make it in the absolute bare minimum. And then once from there, you can then add layers of complexity yourself using the tips and tricks that you know. You can add more flavor, oh, by the way, I want a slightly more smoky flavor. You can add that. I want a little bit more flavor of heat, then, you can appropriately adjust that. It's too hot. I need it to be creamier. So I add some fat or cream and so on. I want a herbal sort of this thing. So you add garnish. I want, it's all too heavy. So I need it's too fatty. So I need to cut through that. So I need some acid, like a lime juice at the end. So, but never follow, if all of this is the recipe, I think that's the wrong way to think about it, right? The second thing is that I often try and find a native language speaker in that. So if it's an Andhra recipe, I try and find someone speaking in Telugu, right? Again, you don't need to understand what they're saying to really, if you just watch it, you can largely make out, what's actually happening, right? As far as on a lighter note, if it's Andhra recipe, just if they say this many number of chilies, cut down half, because otherwise you will burn your insides. Anyway, on that note, but I think, the general idea is that try and find people who are doing that, and more importantly, try and find people who do not have like a fancy studio whose day job is only to sit and make money from YouTube churning out recipes, because they are incentivized not by quality, they're incentivized by quantity. Okay, the YouTube algorithm only rewards people who post like weekly, and it takes a lot of effort to research, do all of this, and so they have a team. They just have to churn it out. It's very professionally done. Often it's not practical. They cut corners. They do use a lot of shortcuts, etc. They use expensive equipment. Find the lowest quality video, and find the oldest looking person who's just perhaps it's a son or someone is recording them and saying, hey, how do you make this thing? And then watch them. You'll often find that will be the most minimalist, quickest, most efficient way of making getting to a dish. And I think this is how I would essentially sort of go about. This is YouTube. Of course, there's an even wider ecosystem of food blogs and so on. If you like reading, obviously, I think read multiple ones and then, see which one is the intersection of all of them and just take the absolute bare minimum and then build your own.
Hi Ashok, follow on for your answer. Like I have seen that a particular recipe is just made by one person, taste same, but not made by the other person. Like if my grandmother makes one recipe, it tastes different, and my mother makes a recipe, it tastes different. Nevertheless, the recipe remains the same, the procedure remains the same, the ingredients remains the same. Why that happens?
Yeah. That's again, there's a chapter in the book that kind of deals with this, right? It's very simplistic to assume that the recipe defines the dish. It doesn't. That's barely scratching the surface, right? So we experience taste on our tongues. It's just 5 things, right? Sweet, salt, bitter, umami, sour, and all that, right? And then our trigeminal nervous system deals with all of the other sensations like heat from chilies, temperature, pH, and many of the other crunchiness, viscosity, and all those other things that tell us the difference between, say, a crisp potato chip and a limp potato chip, and so on, right? Then the biggest part of this is the hundreds of thousands of aromas that we can distinguish, right? A large bulk of which really we smell after you break down food in your mouth with your enzymes, and then all the volatile aromas from the spices are released through the back of your mouth, and then they rise up, and then you smell it on the way you breathe out. That is 80% of what we consider taste, okay? And that's not the end of it. Right? Now let's try and remember how you actually store these memories, right? See, I think metaphorically, if you think about how when we see something, right? Since we know we have cameras and flash storage, it's kind of tempting to assume that we use some kind of similar forms of storage of images in our brains, right? Sound again, we know how we store sounds. You can sort of imagine that there is a part of this thing that remembers sounds, therefore you're able to recall and so on. You can do that with every sort of sensation. But flavor is very multidimensional because it's a bit of touch, it's a bit of smell, it's a bit of sound, crunchiness, and all these other things, etc., etc. It's also sight, what it looks like, and so on. So it turns out, so the body essentially said, I'm not going to create a new part of the brain. Evolution doesn't work that way, right? It's always jugaad. Let's find the best thing that fits. Let me try various things. The one that fits is, it just so turned out that we just use the same part of the brain that deals with nostalgia and long-term storage of memories to deal with flavor. And so when we store flavor memories, it is not just the taste, the mouthfeel, and the aroma, but it is also the context, the setting, the emotion, state of when you were eating, and the people who served that food for you, the place where that food was served, the color of the paint on the wall when that food was served to you. All of this is part of your food memory. And this is why your grandmother's dal tastes different from your mother's dal, because your grandmother is your grandmother. And your grandmother's dal in your memories has your grandmother as part of the memory. And so your mother's dal objectively is not the same thing, right? So this is why chaat tastes better on the street, because that street and the sweat and that experience is part of that flavor experience. So you can have the Michelin star chef give you pani puri in the 5-star hotel. It will not taste the same. Although objectively, if you take aside all the rest of the things, maybe the atta is finer quality, maybe it's been deep fried perfectly, maybe the flavor values, maybe the tamarind sauce is even more sophisticated. None of that matters, because a good bulk of the experience of a chart is actually the experience of the street in your memories, right? That's the reason why, most food opinions are completely, unobjective, right? And this is, you said it right. So, your mother's food will absolutely taste different for the same dish. When you do it, it will taste different from your mother. It's just the way it works.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah. So, Ashok, we have one question in the chat box by Krishna Das. The moment you de-glamorized the role of recipes, was there any backlash from the purists?
I mean, so my non-confrontational approach to a lot of this comes from essentially me spending a lot of my 20s trying to be the sort of the angry atheist, essentially going after every old person in the family and saying all your beliefs are nonsense, all this is superstition, none of this really makes sense, I will not go to a temple, all of this is nonsense, and so on. As you age, you kind of realize that, well, the innocence of youth and naivety of youth aside, that's not how you change people's minds, right? You don't change people's minds by invalidating their experiences, right? And I would say the same thing to I'm not interested in telling someone who believes that the food they eat is the best food in the world and tell them that no, you're wrong, right? The right way to tell them is that no, you're right too, right? Because as far as you're concerned, the food you eat is the best food in the world, and there's nobody can argue with that. But at the same time, you cannot argue that when I eat something that you cannot eat, maybe say dried fish or beef or anything else, you cannot argue with me that it is not acceptable for me to eat it, or it's not possible for me to enjoy it because you cannot enjoy it, right? So in that sense, I think in general, I have largely not paid attention to any kind of a backlash, and at least given my non-confrontational way of really coming at it, I'm not really. It's an easy way to disarm people by telling them that you're absolutely right, and in fact, telling them that, well, your grandma was a better scientist than many of the people on the internet, automatically I think really disarms purists, because that's usually what they're trying to say, that great Indian civilization, we know everything and so on. Very naturally say that, yeah, that part of it, that kind of tacit knowledge that women have passed over the years, practical knowledge of how to really run a home or run a kitchen, is very much grounded in observational science, right? They may not understand the theory. It doesn't matter, right? In the kitchen, it's the knowledge of cooking that matters, not food science. And so, to be honest, I think occasionally somebody will say that, and for reasons, so for some people, for example, one of my things is that I don't believe in the concept of authentic food, for example, because there is no such thing as authentic food, right? Authentic food is your way of saying what I eat is better than what you're eating. That is essentially what the definition of authentic food is, right? But obviously, I will not argue with someone who says, oh, this is authentic food. By all means, let them believe that. I have no problems with that, right? So I would rather share my point of view publicly with people who are willing to listen than try to change the mind of someone who has a view of food in their own way, right? Food is so deeply personal that there is really just, there is nothing nice about invalidating someone's ideas of food.
Hi, Ashok. So my question is, like in this entire journey, have you discovered the science of staying fit, or to be more precise, science of losing weight? Because right now there are so many diet gurus in the market where one is saying you should eat every 2 hours, and there is one group of people who are saying like you should have a gap between at least 16 hours of gap between 2 meals or something like that. So what kind of science do you follow to stay fit, and any special formula or suggestion you can give to your audience?
So basic first suggestion on health is, do not listen to anecdotal experiences of unqualified people such as me when it comes to something really important like diet and nutrition. And again, I very repeatedly, sometimes when I do these food talks on Masala Lab, right? I will often say, please don't ask questions on health and nutrition. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a nutritionist. And it is important in today's society, in the kind of, the anti-vax sort of culture that we seem to have built and so on, in this, where everybody Googles and believes that they know better than a doctor. That it is, I think, irresponsible as science communicators to sort of pass off personal anecdotal experiences as health advice. I think the only scientifically accurate thing that can be said about health and nutrition is that everyone is unique, right? And the other thing that can be said is that we still have a lot to understand. And the science is forever changing, right? I grew up in the 80s when my mother used to be really, really careful about the amount of oil and ghee that she uses. She used to say, oh, ghee, I'm told it's saturated fat, it's bad for your heart's health. And so she would use refined vegetable oils, right? In 2020, no, the science is now clear that, well, please use the ghee, please avoid the refined vegetable oil, that the omega-6 fatty acids in refined vegetable oils are not good for you, right, on the long run, right? And again, likewise, I think there's a lot of history as well, right? It's only when Eisenhower had a heart attack when he was in the White House, and the doctor who happened to treat him essentially ended up writing a white paper that essentially said saturated fats are to blame. And he commissioned a study, like good scientists do. He found data from many countries about their diets, people who ate high saturated fat diets versus people who ate, less saturated fat diets. And he basically cherry-picked all the countries where they had bad effects and ignored all the places where they had perfectly healthy lives with saturated fat. Namely, places like, say, Alaska or, northern Canada, where the Inuits, they don't eat plants. Their entire diet is saturated fat, whale blubber and seal blubber and protein. That's it. Today we think, oh, you need iron from this, you need banana, you need potassium, you need this, etc. Inuits eat just whale blubber and seal blubber, which is just mostly saturated fat, because animal fat is saturated, and protein from the muscle tissue. That's it. They lead perfectly happy lives, and they're very, very healthy. They live very, very long lives and so on. So I think the problem often is that every one of these fat diets is essentially fails at the point where it's based on poor science. It's not based on, it doesn't account for emerging science. And third, more obvious reason is that it's a hard habit to form. Right? So if it's a hard habit to form, it's just not practical. We, at the end of the day, we are human beings, right? So, and again, as I said, I'm also, and a whole bunch of the things related to weight loss, etc., have to do with genetics. A good chunk of it has to do with genetics, and that is not in our hands, right? I've been at the same weight since my 20s, and that is due to my genetics, because my father was like that, right? And my grandfather was exactly like that, right? So the point is that every one of us has a nature component in terms of gene, then there's a nurture component, and there are now we are discovering new things. Like, for example, India became, all of a sudden, a lot of Indians came to the middle class in the 1990s post-liberalization. Okay? And so those who were already middle class did not have, nutritional deficiencies. Okay, not much of a change, right? If anything, we started eating more unhealthy food, right? So we started eating more pizza and burgers and all that. Okay, but for people who were malnourished and then moved into the lower middle class post-liberalization, right? The first generation of those women, apparently, it's quite interesting, a fascinating study that basically said that we have epigenetic sort of features, how our genes express themselves rather than just being encoded, right? Where if you grew up malnourished, right, your body is going to have epigenetic markers that say that you don't get food often enough, okay? And when that woman has a child, right, that child's epigenetic expression is going to be, whenever you get food, put on fat, do not make it available as energy, because I don't know when this person is going to get food next time. But we're all programmed like that. In fact, it's quite interesting, right? The reason we now have a problem with fructose is that hunter-gatherers, the only time they get carbohydrates was once a year during summer when fruits were ripe. And so the way the body evolved is that whenever you taste fructose, which is the sweetest sugar known, you don't turn it into glucose and make it available for the body like it is with glucose, instant energy, but instant the liver is programmed to convert it to fat right away. Okay. So how many people know that it is eating fruits that make you fat now? But 200,000 years ago, it was a survival mechanism, because those that put on weight by eating fruits and survived winters when they would not eat anything. There is no agriculture, no animals to hunt. You just have to hibernate and live off the fat in your body. And so people had to put on visceral fat, they had to put on tummy fat. And then by the time winter is over, they would come completely scrawny. Then they would go hunt and start getting animals and start picking berries again, right? So But the problem is now, you get fruits 365, 24/7. And we drink fruit juices, which are again terrible. Right? So the thing is that every one of these things is so tricky and so hard for people to really get a handle on. Right? And so there is truly no universal health advice other than eat as little as possible. Basically, right? Eat as many diverse things as possible so that you get all your macronutrients, but eat as little as possible, especially as little carbohydrates as possible. Especially as little refined carbohydrates as possible. I mean, it's like really resistant starch things. So, maybe, instead of millets instead of rice, or rice or wheat, right? Or pulses, more rajma, more chana, and those kinds of things if you're vegetarian, right? Lean protein, again, particularly seafood, right? Over, red meat, again, which also has other problems from a sustainability standpoint and so on. And again, as Michael Pollan's advice, eat food, meaning that anything that doesn't come out of a packet, mostly plants, as much as possible, mostly plants, again, from a sustainability standpoint, not too much. So that is pretty much the only scientifically valid universal advice. All the rest is just fad and subject to change, right? So I think, that's the interesting thing.
Okay, so Ashok, I have a question. I mean, I have to ask this. So you studied electronic engineering. You're working as a software engineer. And when I'm listening to your talk, you're talking about capsaicin, trigeminal ganglion, epigenetic mechanism. So it literally took me back to my neuroscience classes when I was doing during my PhD and felt like I'm speaking to some professor and having discussion about how exactly all these things work. So it's like, how do you find time for all these things? I mean, I know how difficult it can be to, go into detail, read papers and study all these things. So, and just to follow up that one more thing, like how important hobbies are like in your overall setup.
No, I think, see, clearly one is on the lighter note, one of the important skills in the corporate world to really grow in your corporate is the ability to use a small amount of knowledge to appear very knowledgeable. While sort of creating the illusion of depth with actually very thin layer on top, right? And I think so. Half an hour conversation with me, you'll go away thinking, "Oh wow, professor." Okay. But if you have a 5-hour conversation, we'll go, okay, guy doesn't know beyond that, right? Because I think a lot of my interests go back to being a quizzer in school. One of the, in a sense, successful quizzers, right, are very good at handpicking what they want to remember and skipping the boring bits. Right? So that's one skill I have. So I know all the interesting stories, right? So I don't know the boring stories, but a lot of real, actual, practical day-to-day science cannot ignore the boring stuff, okay? Because that's where all the details are. So that's one. So again, my goal again is as a science communicator, I'm interested in taking complex things and then sort of telling interesting stories about them in a way that is definitely simplified, but not oversimplified to the point of being misleading. I think that's often the line that it's always a tricky thing to oversimplify, right? And I sometimes find that, sometimes on one of my Instagram posts where I sort of make some random connection between some historical event and some scientific thing and do that to tell an interesting story, there'll be some deep actual expert who will come and say, that's not what quite happened. There were all these other elements as well. That in a sense, it's a fundamental, a dilemma of science, right? You take a white paper, right? A scientific white paper is first and foremost an exercise in caveats. It says, here's what this is not. Here are all the assumptions. Here is the under only these situations is all the rest of the following true. Is a very, very hard story to tell anyone. Right. And so therefore, I think a science communicator often has to somehow skip all of those things and tell all of the interesting parts without coming across as oversimplifying. Right. So in that sense, again, I think I was fortunate that I one quizzing habit, and then therefore also my note-taking ability meant that when I read books, I would summarize and write the 10 most important things that I want to remember from this book. Right. And I used to be paper notes, and now it is a Google sheet. Where I sort of, in fact, the reason I often use Kindle editions is because it allows me to mark the things that I want to remember. But then I also remembered that the act of making bookmarking easy has resulted in poorer quality bookmarks, too many bookmarks. So I'm now like, no, you know what? I will still want to write down on paper, because that will force me to truly think hard about what I want to write down. And then the act of writing also reinforces how you want to do that, as opposed to the lazy act of just marking something on a page, right? And so in that sense, I think it is, so you know, again, as I said, don't be under the illusion that I have any more depth beyond the ability to tell interesting stories and get people interested to then go further deep into something. So that's one thing. And I think hobbies, essentially, I think, I mean, so the reason is that I took up a job in IT because it was the most amount of pay for the least amount of cognitive work, and which therefore freed me up for doing, you know, other things, right? And again, IT is one of those things where if you're good at IT, you don't have to work hard enough, right? IT is the classical place which the true engineering maxim of a lazy engineer is a good engineer is true only in IT. Okay, saying that a lazy engineer will automate everything, right, and write the leanest, most efficient code and finish, estimate 20 hours to do something, finish it in 2 hours. Okay. And get paid for 20 hours. So that's, again, you know, that's the profit mindset. And then use those 18 hours to do other things, right? Use those 18 hours to do learn other musical instruments, and so on. So for me, I think so, because my hobbies were important, I sort of changed. I designed my career around my hobbies as opposed to the other way around, right? And so yeah, I think also having multiple hobbies, you find very interesting interdisciplinary sort of ways in which, you know, me learning music, I can learn an instrument faster because, you know, I break it down into ways, you know, algorithmically think about how I have to learn it and so on, right? And likewise, constructing elaborate music, you know, arranging harmonies and all of that, I really think it helps you crack harder problems in software engineering as well, right? So it has, each of these things has a sort of like these interesting effects that are hard to describe, but again, you might understand it as a somebody who understands the brain. It's sometimes hard to say how, you know, one activity somewhere can affect your proficiency in another activity. And in my experience, I've also found that starting to learn something and then taking a break, learning up to a level, taking a long break, then coming back to it and repeating those basics, I find that I learn at a much faster pace. And so these are all these things that I've discovered over the years, and so on.
Thank you so much, Ashok. Santoshi, we are actually running a little bit late, but we can do like a quick rapid fire round. Rajshri has created some really interesting questions for Ashok, and maybe after that, Santoshi, you can ask questions. So
Sure.
Rajshri, please go ahead.
Yeah. So can I start? Okay.
Go ahead.
So Ashok, describe yourself in 3 words.
Oh, 3 words. Oh, really, really difficult. Impatient, analytical, and musical. I think those are the 3 words I pick. Yes.
What is your inflection point in this entire journey?
It's hard to say. I sort of, I think it feels retrospectively, it feels like a continuous thing. But Penguin first approached me many years ago when I used to be a blogger and I had a popular blog and so on. And then at that point of time, I told them, you know, I was one of those techno utopian tech bros who said, oh, all these books and all will die. Everything will be interactive, Kindle, and I will self-publish. You know, why do I need a middleman where I have to pay 90% of my royalties to you and so on, right? So that was the mindset I had. But then over time, you know, I became, you know, a lot more of a technology skeptic, if you will, at least of a lot of social media. And despite me being, you know, notionally active, but that again is an illusion. Okay, so I post, but I don't check notifications. So I have all my phone notifications are off. Okay, so in a sense, I would actually say my inflection point is actually when I deleted my Facebook account and really started paying attention to the amount of time that I was spending online. Okay. Again, there is an illusion that I spend a lot of time, but I spend less than half an hour on the internet every day. So at least on social media, it's scrolling through stuff and so on, right? So I think is the inflection point where I started reading more books, started getting more output in terms of being able to spend that time to put down 65,000 words. Otherwise, I was in a frame of mindset where I just need to churn out a 140 character tweet or some meme or a 5-minute video, and that's really all there is to this. And this, I think, it was an inflection point.
Okay. What are the 3 things you can't live without?
I think chilies, because I'm obsessed with chilies. And so every country I visit, I travel on work, and I particularly find excuses to keep traveling to our Mexico office just so that I can buy chilies and bring them back to India. They have the best chilies in the world. And so clearly, I think chilies is one. I think I would say my violin is probably another one, but also I'm sort of partial to the guitar because it's a more convenient thing to just doodle something rather than a violin. And then the other, I think, would be my notebook for noting down things.
Okay. Your favorite cuisine?
Mexican, no doubt. Yes. Mexican, Thai, Indian. Yeah.
Okay.
And within Indian, Bengali.
What's the funniest moment you have had in a kitchen while cooking?
So funniest moment is essentially the very first time I went to the US, and I decided to impress my roommates by saying, hey, you know what? I know cooking. Of course, those guys did. And they said, okay, fine. They're happy to wash dishes while I cook. And then I said, okay, I picked the most really complicated Parsi dish, a vegetable dish, some tarkari, do bafat or something like that. And it was a complicated dish because it involved eggs also. Okay. And then, a 20-year-old me didn't quite have the practical knowledge or the scientific knowledge of, how proteins denature at a much lower temperature and they get really, really hard. But whereas a potato or a carrot takes a long time to cook and so on. So I just dumped everything in one shot. So the first cut, I said, okay, the eggs look pretty cooked. And then I realized that the potatoes were still raw. And then I tried closing it and simmering it and so on. Ultimately, by the time the carrots and the potatoes were cooked, the eggs were just rubber, right? And so that was essentially, and this was the first time I invited a bunch of my friends and said, hey, by the way, I'm like I know cooking and all of you guys don't, right? I invited a bunch of, my female colleagues back then as well, potentially to impress them, saying that, hey, here's a guy who cooks again. This was, the early 2000s. Not as common as it is now. And so, yeah, so that was a grand disaster, if you will. Yes.
Best moment of your career so far?
Hard to say, depending on what career, IT career or writing career or music and all that. But I think I would actually say that me moving from the traditional IT sort of role into a R&D role within TCS, I think really offered me the creativity and the opportunity to work with a lot of really smart people. So most people don't realize this, but TCS has invest more in core R&D than most other IT companies in India. So in fact, we have like about 3,000 or so people who are, of which about 500 or 600 of them are PhDs, and PhDs from like Yale, MIT, and Harvard, and places like that. And they run research labs on like core computer science, genomics, essentially wherever there's an intersection between a real world science and software, right? Algorithmic drug discovery is one of those areas that TCS does fundamental research in and has like patents and all that, right? And so me moving from the traditional services side, I spent about 10 years in the R&D side, I think was where my focus was actually research on the internet, on internet behavior, on social media behavior, on social collaboration, how people behaved in large groups, crowdsourcing and things like that. And clearly, at that point of time, my boss felt that a PhD was not the right person to do this kind of research. It just needed someone who understood that world better. And I think, that was really a great moment, because I think those 10 years were very, I had the exposure to, obviously I had the ability to be mentored and talk to some of the finest academics in the world, including, computer scientists like Jeff Ullman, right, who advises TCS, who's written all the seminal books on computer science, right? Is from Stanford, right? And likewise, I think looking at problems in a much, much more deeper way, right? And also kind of understanding things like how machine learning and AI works in a way that I think was very, very useful in how I think about the world subsequently.
So next one is little funny question. What do you enjoy cooking, and do you do all the cooking at home? And is your wife happy with your intervention in the kitchen?
It is. So that's a tricky question. So it's interesting. So I have a 9-year-old son, right? And my wife handles all of the cooking for him specifically, right? So my son is like, he'll eat a few things, right? Not my fancy experiments. For him, it needs to be deep fried. It needs to be something simple. It has to be. We've slowly improved his taste, but as a 9-year-old, you know how kids are. He's still not going to eat all my fancy related things, right? So therefore, so she still has to sort of deal with him on a daily basis. But the way we do this is essentially that I've also sort of simplified my life further by demolishing my older house and building a ground floor where my mother lives, another house above where my in-laws live, and I live in the second floor. So in a sense, I've optimized a lot of its stuff because once a while my mother will cook, once a while my in-laws will cook, and sometimes I will cook. So if I don't necessarily have to cook every day, that's one thing. And even otherwise, I think I do intermittent fasting, and both of us do intermittent fasting. So again, so we don't eat anything, we don't eat breakfast. So breakfast is not a thing at all. So we only eat lunch and dinner between 12 and 8, right? So 16 hours, we don't eat anything. Somebody asked me about health, I said, but again, let me preface it by saying intermittent fasting may not be for everyone. So talk to a doctor or a nutritionist before you begin. So the other thing is that I think in the early days, it used to be a case of I would just make a mess of the kitchen, and my wife would be like, oh, I have to deal with all of this mess now. But I think over time we've started sharing those chores, and also as my mindset is, I will invest in technology to solve the problem. So, okay, let's buy a dishwasher, right? And let's buy as many gadgets as possible that are, but I think over time, I've gotten a greater appreciation for making slightly more sensible purchases. It's actually quite interesting. Once you really listen to women, particularly once I started really listening to my wife, as opposed to immediately saying, okay, I have a solution for the problem, you realize that most devices and appliances in India are terribly designed. Okay? They've been designed by men for women, which is a terrible thing. Okay? They're not designed to be cleaned easily. Many of those things sometimes require physical strengths that have to, that are not easy for women to deal with. They get stuck in all kinds of weird ways in which they're harder to service and things like that. So I think one of the things I keep telling appliance manufacturers when I speak to them is that please improve the diversity in your engineering design, right? Because I think your products are all terrible. So in that sense, I think over time I've learned that obviously that the actual act of cooking is only 10 or 20% of the whole thing. Prepping is the big problem. Okay. And so I often sometimes would outsource the more painful tasks to my wife, like peeling shallots, which are some of the most painful things to peel. I think they're called Madras shallots, so the really small ones, right? So sambar onions, they're called, right? They're very tasty, but they're just too painful to peel. And likewise, things like, peeling ginger, which has all of these too many branches and so on. But yeah, I think we tend to share responsibilities. I wouldn't say that I do all the cooking. I think if you consider activities in the kitchen, I think it would be safe to say that it's probably 70-30 in favor of my wife in terms of all of the things, all the way from cleaning, stocking the kitchen, taking care of stuff, cooking for my son and everything else. So
one last question. If I may ask, what next book you are planning to write? Is there any books there in the pipeline?
There are. So Penguin has been hounding me to start, putting together the table of contents and start writing. I've been quite lazy, to be honest. There are some things, you'll hear about them. I don't think I can talk about them right away. We're still in the process of figuring out. Yes, they will probably be still in the food and the intersection of science and history, that kind of space. There is also a sort of like a very early plan to come up with a more richer edition of Masala Lab with more illustrations, a higher quality, because we targeted a paperback because it came out during the pandemic, right? And then so the business reason was that anything more than 250 rupees nobody will buy. Okay. So and so 500 rupee books were not to people's appetite during the pandemic and so on, right? So now we're thinking about a hardbound edition that perhaps will have more illustrations, more algorithms, and more of these kinds of things, more updates, if you will. So that's being worked upon. So that's essentially what's happening.
Okay. Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Ashok. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Ashok, for this amazing session and taking the time to meet us today. We are almost top of an hour. So if you have any other questions, you can contact Ashok on LinkedIn, Twitter, or Instagram. So goodbye for now.
A network should last a lifetime. Let us help you create lasting professional relationships with our world-class mentors through the Biopatrika Industry Mentorship Program. A strategic guidance program unlike no other, full of expert interviews, industry internship opportunities, CV writing, inflection point analysis, life maps, and of course, the gateway to your dream career. For a limited time only, all our services are freely available for you as we truly want you to succeed.